Hello and welcome to Springboard, the podcast out of Bakerview Church. My name is Jonathan. I'm one of the pastors at Bakerview. This is episode 21. We have Kerry here, who is the lead pastor of Bakerview. Hello, Kerry. How's it going?
Hey, Jonathan. It's going well on this beautiful day.
Yes, we're here Tuesday morning to record this, and what this podcast is just a chance to talk more in depth about the sermon. That I think we all know that in 30 minutes you can't say all the things about a topic, and if we're honest, you can't say the rest of it on a podcast either. But
Yeah.
We are trying. So
We never finish the conversation. We just try and keep it going. Yeah.
Which is great, and I think people are enjoying this opportunity just to dig in more. So this week we started a new sermon series. Kerry, you started with a sermon titled "Resting Like God," and this theme, this sermon series that we're doing, is very pertinent to where we're at today, because we're talking about work, rest, and play, and everyday conversations about life, which I think is much needed, and something a lot of us are missing. I think is just conversations with each other, with people in our church community. And so this is a great opportunity, this series, to plug in with other people and just talk about how life is going. And you started with this idea of rest, and you acknowledged that for many of us, this time during this pandemic and this at-home kind of isolation has been a time of forced rest, which and you mentioned in your sermon, people are experiencing differently. Like I don't know about you, but yeah, I've heard people who, like, that was just so exciting at first. It was like a sabbatical, a chance to almost say, oh, I don't have to do all those things. I don't have a social calendar anymore. I got to take a break.
Yeah.
And others, right away, it was difficult because that's what you want, and you want to be with people. And I think no matter where you were at the first couple of weeks of this pandemic, now further in, I think everyone in some way is feeling the grief or the exhaustion of what we're in. Like, I remember I was actually a little bit excited too at the start, just to say, oh, I have a bit of a break. But now it's difficult. It's hard to be in this time of rest, and I wouldn't say I feel fully rested, even though I'm have more time to rest than before. I don't know how you felt through it, Kerry.
Yeah. Well, some similar feelings in a way. There's the old saying goes, a change is just as good as a break. So it's something new that we get to experience and try and so that's fun in a way to figure that out. But because it's something that has been forced upon us to a large degree, it changes the nature of how we experience this rest. If rest is forced on me, is it really rest? If I don't choose it, is it doing what it's supposed to be doing inside of me? And I guess we could talk about the whole Sabbath rhythm in that. Is that forced upon us? It was a command back in the Old Testament. So maybe there's something inherent in stopping, even if it is forced upon us, that does something good in us. But it's not a formula that automatically achieves something. We have to be engaged with it in a conscious way, with mind and heart and body as well. So
Yeah, no, I agree that totally. I think force is a strong word, like it is obviously now today, but there is something unnatural about
right.
choosing rest. It kind of just happens to us. Like for many people, rest comes when you're so exhausted, or it's the end of the day and you can finally, write that last email, go to bed, or the kids are finally in bed and you can get some rest, some sleep. Usually is what we think of with rest, but it comes at this point usually when there's no energy left and we have to rest.
Yeah, it's like we're at this place of exhaustion, and we collapse and
Yeah.
our rest. And that reveals the finite nature of who we are as humans. That I think I said in the sermon, if we don't sleep, eventually we will die. We
Yeah.
we have to sleep. Our bodies need that to stay alive. But the whole thing of choosing to rest is where we want to get at with the power of what we're talking about, and the wonder of how Sabbath keeping is woven into that. I think that's where we can begin to mine the depths of rest for us, and what God was giving us when He instituted rest, even in creation, the creation
Yeah.
of the world.
Yeah, so I want to get into that first, because I think what we're initially talking about here, um, in the place that people are in now, they're maybe not waiting until they're exhausted to rest, but we feel in some sense we have a forced rest where we're just less busy, we're less hurried, and while that seems good, it might not always feel good, because it's revealing some things about us.
Yeah.
I think it would be fair to say. I know for myself that's what it feels like. The more time I have to rest, the more time I have to think, and the more time I start to be aware of some of the pieces of me that I'm not so proud of, and I think the word that comes to my mind is identity. So I want to ask you a little bit about that. When we are forced to rest, or when we choose to proactively rest, what goes on? What happens to us? What is that? What does that do to someone as they continue to rest and choose that? What is the purpose behind it, I guess?
Well, I think here the purpose behind rest is to find a rhythm that has work involved. Rest doesn't mean anything really if we're not resting from something.
Mm,
When we think about our lives today, uh, you might think that being in a time of retirement, and maybe this is a call out to all our retirees who happen to be listening. What's rest like for you when you're not going to work 5 or 6 days a week, that kind of a thing. So the meaning of rest comes when we choose to stop from our work, and
mm,
our identity really in this culture is so wrapped up in what we do.
mm-hmm,
And at points we've worn busyness as a badge of honor, because we're important, because we're busy,
mm,
and our identity and our feelings of worth are tied up into that.
mm,
So when we start to build rest into our lives, and make it an important, and we make ceasing from work an important part of who we are, then all of a sudden we have to come to terms with our identity being something apart from our work,
mm,
and then we need to think about who we are as much as what we do. Both are important.
mm,
We'll talk about this at the end a bit, but Jeff's going to start us off next week talking about working like God,
mm,
and there's a sense of calling in our work that truly is part of our identity.
mm-hmm,
Um, but there's a line in there somewhere where we don't want to earn our sense of self-worth out of what we do. It's given to us by God. God gives us a calling, and somehow rest is tied into that calling that's connected to our relationship with Him. And
mm,
so then we can enter into rest as a delight, as a choice, because we know that our identity isn't completely wrapped up in what we do.
mm,
I've sometimes over the years, speaking as my role, my calling as a pastor, and even more specifically as a preacher, when there's weeks when I'm not speaking, and I'll sort of have a moment sometimes in those weeks where I'm going like, what do I do? Because I'm not doing this thing that
mm,
that in some ways, if I look at it from an unhealthy perspective, something where I derive my sense of self-worth from. And
yeah,
so it when we're resting from that, it gives us an opportunity to actually engage with God in a different way, not just through what we do, but who He's made us to be, and just the relationship with Him, the communion with Him in that. So rest, it forces us to, or it gives us an opportunity. That's probably a better way to put it, to think about who we are in a broader sense, not just tied to what we do.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, it in some ways it might feel like a bit of an identity crisis if that's
Yeah.
some stuff you need to work on. It might feel like it gets worse before it gets better. That's why it's hard for some people to slow down, because
Yeah,
work is a great distraction. Busyness is a great distraction.
for sure.
But when you work through that, or if you have worked through that, yeah, you can, like you said, you can delight in this rest as a place to go to deepen and that understanding and experience of God's love for you, and His unconditional love and grace that you do not have to earn, but is just there, and you can know that that's there, and that can be deepened by slowing down, because it can be so easy to forget that in this world of producing and achieving, and this reward system we live in, that when you work hard you earn more, whether that's more respect, more money,
Yeah.
more productivity, all those things. And that there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself, but it's so easy for that to become the purpose of life. And then the inverse of that is when we don't work, and we don't produce, and we don't achieve, and people don't tell us how much we've done, we feel like we're worthless. And that's the real place where it gets distorted. That I think, like you're saying, rest is a time to recreate that, to reorient ourselves, to know that we're people who are loved by God first, for who we are. Working and doing something is absolutely part of being human, and part of God's kingdom, but that's not our sole identity piece.
Absolutely, yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
when it does become the focus, then pride issues seep in, and
Yeah.
we kind of get the chest puffed out, and look at me kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that can slip in very, very subtly.
Mm-hmm.
Pride is sneaky. Yeah.
Yeah, over time. Yeah. Well, what I hear from all this is, and you talk about this as you go into the New Testament, a bit in your sermon, talking about Jesus, and this idea that Sabbath and rest is not something that we have to do, or yes, it was commanded to the Israelites, but so much of what Jesus does is takes the commands and kind of the morals or attributes that God kind of gives to His people in the Old Testament, and Jesus reminds people of the heart behind them, the depth, the why of why you're doing these things. Because I think when a lot of people look at the Old Testament, they just see a bunch of legalistic rules, and good theology shows us that those rules were there for a greater purpose. They weren't just there because God wanted to command something, but it was actually to bring His people of God to be people who bless the whole world. And Sabbath was a way they did that. Just like for us, for them to not work and to choose those things was countercultural in some ways back then as well. So Jesus comes in and is reminding people of that, because you can talk about this a little bit more, that the religious establishment of the day viewed Sabbath very differently than Jesus did.
Well, they maybe at the starting point they didn't, but there was such an elaborate system built around the Sabbath to keep this commandment, to keep it holy, and the Pharisees, who knows how we can get into their hearts, but perhaps there was some well-intentioned purpose in desiring to keep the Sabbath so well, but in building all the second and third level rules around the keeping of the Sabbath, this human system had been put around it. In his book Garden City that you've pointed us to, John Mark Homer talks about the fence that they built around the Sabbath. So a whole bunch of rules that would build a fence around the Sabbath, just so that you could make sure that you would keep the Sabbath. And so Sabbath keeping became about keeping all of these rules, and it was such an elaborate system, and it became a burden for people.
Mm.
In the sermon I was talking a little bit about, probably when a time when my grandparents were kids. We heard, when we were little, we heard a few of these stories. Sandy and I were talking about them, about how they weren't allowed to go and throw a ball back and forth on Sunday afternoon, because that's not what you do on Sunday. It's just a day of rest. And it was just like, oh, the kids hated Sunday because it was so boring. And that's not what Sabbath is about. Life. It's a celebration. And we probably need to have another message on Sabbath as celebration.
Yes.
Not as rest. It's broadening the perspective on it. So
yes. So when it has these rules behind it, like I think for kids, that I think my dad experienced that as well, where it's just kind of, you don't do this because that's what you don't do. Yeah. And there isn't, even as a kid, to not hear the why behind a rule, makes a kid probably want to break it more. But B, like it's something that they just don't see the heart behind. And so there's a constant wisdom in that as parents, but as the church as well, when we have all these kind of rules for people, and people look at the church as a bunch of rules. We don't abolish all of it and say do whatever you want, but we have to bring life and wisdom into the rules or orders or commands of God, because we have to know they come from a loving and good God, that if he's commanding things, it's love is at the heart of that in some way, and we have to find that, rather than just strip it of all of that and say you need to follow this rule because
totally
God says so.
And that's what Jesus was getting at in dealing with the Pharisees, both in that Mark 2:23-24, that section there, where he says the Sabbath wasn't made for man or for humans, but or what's the right way to put it? It was made for us, not us for it. It's a good gift to us. And when we Sandy walked in, that's all. It's all good. Life goes on. He gave us Sabbath for our good, and what he saw happening was that it wasn't good for the people. And Jesus was a Sabbath keeper in the way that it was intended to be. He saw the value in it, which is why he did good on the Sabbath. I think he deliberately got in the face of the Pharisees by healing on the Sabbath and doing these things to make the point that it is for us, something that does wonder and good in us. And really, I was thinking about this too when I looked at all the 10 Commandments, for example. There's a lot of don't do in the 10 Commandments. But when you tie not only the Sabbath commandment back to creation, and we were going to talk a little bit about the connection between creation and new creation in Sabbath keeping. This is a little segue into that. All of the commandments really, when we keep them, point to a kind of life that we long for, a kind of existence that we hope for, that we were made for. And that's what creation was intended to be, and then sin marred that. That's part of our grand story now. But new creation looks to the restoration of what it was intended to be. And the keeping of all the commandments, not as rules, but just as when we live in that shalom existence, that's how it will be. There won't be coveting, there won't be stealing, there won't be lying, because we'll be living in this wonderful new creation shalom existence, where rest and work will be in this perfect combination, this perfect rhythm, where there'll be no hurry and no rush. There'll be enough time and enough of everything for us to enjoy. I'm getting excited about new creation here.
Awesome. Yeah. I quickly want to share, just before we get more into that, about
I jumped the gun, sorry.
No, that's okay. My experience, I would say my first experience really of Sabbath was in a few years ago. Brittany and I, with Columbia Bible College, went to Jerusalem for a course, and so I would have been the first weekend we were there. I believe Friday night, once dusk comes, Sabbath begins. So as the sun's going down, and we were in the old city of Jerusalem, and all of a sudden this young, probably 30-year-old guy with a yarmulke on comes up to us and he asks, "Are we Jewish?" And I said no, and he was mostly talking to me. Like our group was kind of off to the side, and I said no, I'm not. And he said, "Can you come with me?" And like when you're traveling in general, you probably shouldn't just follow strangers. And maybe I'm just too, I think the best of people, but I was like, this seems like a nice guy. So I just looked at my group and said, "Oh, this guy needs my help," and just followed him. And so they kind of half follow because they're like, "What are you doing?" And we get to this. It's so interesting being in Jerusalem because you get this mix of old city and all of a sudden brand new
Yeah.
infrastructure. So there's this hotel right there, and there's just this magnificent dining hall. Everything's white and modern and fancy. And this guy said they're a family from New York that all came out here for his cousins or his nephew's bar mitzvah.
Yeah.
And so they, I guess, to come to Israel and to Jerusalem, it just made it extra sacred and special to have it there. But it was the Sabbath, and they couldn't turn the lights on in the dining hall. Like they couldn't figure them out. And because it was the Sabbath and they were observing it, none of the Jewish people could touch the breaker or any of the light switches.
Because that would be work.
Yeah, so yeah, exactly. That would be work. And so even to this day, what you're saying about the Pharisees, in some sense, that observance, that strict idea of those things, people are following. So it's just this almost comical moment where I'm there. I know nothing about electrical boxes and breakers, so I'm just trying to listen to what he's saying, and he has his hand right there, but he can't touch it. But he's trying to direct me, and we finally get it, and they all laugh and celebrate. And so it was just this kind of delve into this world of, wow, like this is alive today. Like people, and it would be massively incorrect to generalize that Jewish people today are still all following it that way. But there's this just mix of, it is Sabbath, we should follow it. Here's some of the things, and yeah, I think we all, and in Christianity, we need reminders of all the things that we follow. Why are we following them? And what is the good purpose of what we're doing here? Because if a rule starts to rule over us, like the Sabbath was ruling over the Pharisees, then good and new creation can't come out of it. It restricts us and it drains life from us, I think. So
yeah, that's a good image. It constricts us rather than opens us up.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I don't think a lot of people, certainly kids, when their parents give them rules, think that those rules are opening up their world, but in a way it is. And when rules are given in a healthy, good way, that they can do that. So I want to close out just with that conversation you were bringing us into about this idea of Sabbath as a time to anticipate new creation. And that was probably my favorite line. Definitely the line, as I was listening to your sermon, that just popped up, like, what does that mean? Like I had never even heard it that way. This idea of anticipating new creation is not a new idea to me, but this connection to Sabbath, I was just fascinated by. So I just want you to unpack that a little bit more. What does that mean for Sabbath to do that?
Well, it's kind of a new concept for me too that I came across. So maybe I took a risk to put it in a sermon when I'm still just.
We were all learners,
but we're in process with these things, and it just seemed to the whole concept of signposts. Like when we practice Sabbath, when we choose to stop working, when we choose to stop doing the thing that we need to do to sustain life. So whether that's your job or from which you get a paycheck, or whether it's if you're a student and it's your studying, that is the thing that you must do in order to achieve or to produce what you're working on. When we choose to stop that thing that we must do, then we're we're getting in touch with creation and the pattern. And I mean, God gave us the pattern in the seventh day because he stopped from his work. He was finished. We're never finished. He wasn't tired, but he was finished. So he built that pattern in for us. And whenever we enter into this work stoppage, the stopping of production, we're tying ourselves back to creation, which then is not a big step to go from creation to new creation, because that's what God wanted for us, is this beautiful world that he made where we would flourish in the garden. We've left that behind because of our rebellion, but right away God planted the seed for new creation. Even in the curse in Genesis 3, when the hope of Jesus is built into that 3:15, where he will bite your heel, but you will crush his head. I mean, I probably should unpack that a little bit more, but we're going to run out of time on that. But even right from there, the seeds of restoration were put into it. And so when we keep the Sabbath, we're entering into the seed of new creation and what is going to be becoming. So, maybe I'm encouraging, our listeners and myself along the way to, when we are a little more intentional with our rest and, and even the 24-hour deal is probably another conversation as well. But there's something about choosing to stop for a day.
Yeah.
That itself is a powerful signpost looking ahead to new creation. And then we need to talk about, how do we keep the Sabbath from a celebrative standpoint? Do things that we get to do, not things that we have to do. So all of that to me is part of what's pointing to new creation. That as we look ahead, looking back and looking ahead is what Sabbath does, and then it starts to keep us.
Yeah. No, I love that. I really hear in that it's a time to anticipate and reflect and imagine, and I would say realize that our life is bigger than ourselves. That the being a follower of Jesus is entering into a larger story, a story that's begins at the garden, and it's not just scriptures we read because we should, but we see this story as our own story, and that we're a part of it. That these seeds that are planted for recreation, those seeds are growing to this day, and we are people that sow those seeds as followers of Jesus today. And we do that through everything we do, that our relationships, our work, what we call our job, everything, every hour of our life in some way is contributing to that. And so I love that Sabbath is the time to realign and remember that, because it is so easy to lose sight of that, even as pastors, when our job is to be the people that are telling you other people to do that like there is times where it's just like, this just feels like work. And that's the I think the understanding that we're still broken, and this world is not as it ought to be yet, and so work won't always feel those ways. But that's why we need that reminder that that doesn't get the last say, that it's like, oh, we can't do this, there's no hope. We have to remind ourselves that there is hope, there is redemption, there is restoration, and we bring that in some way as people in the kingdom. That it obviously is God and his power, but we get to participate in that. And I think that's a powerful image, and something we need time to think about and dream about. And so what a great way to do that, but on a Sabbath, have a Sabbath rest to do that.
We have some time on the Sabbath to do that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's awesome. I think that's a lot. It's given me a lot to think about. I hope people feel encouraged and challenged.
Yeah, I hope so.
By this message.
Yeah, we sure don't want this, oh, I got to learn how to rest better now. Mm-hmm. Don't want this concept to become a burden for people. So let's have conversation about it and give yourself freedom to figure it out and to not that we try to make mistakes along the way, but it's okay to fail along the way because we're trying to grow, and we're not in new creation yet. We're seeing the signs, but the sign isn't the destination. But hopefully, we're moving in a positive direction.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I think that's gives a lot to unpack, and so people know that there is home church questions available on the sermon. So those are available on the website. So you can go into those and find people to discuss with. If you're someone that is new to Bakerview or has been at Bakerview but doesn't necessarily feel connected, and you feel like you're listening to these podcasts or the sermons on your own, please email Kerry or myself or Jeff or any of the pastors, because we would love to connect people in this time when we feel isolated into groups to be able to connect more and discuss and have these everyday conversations about life. So
For sure.
I think that's very important that we can do this with others. Yeah, I just want to close off talking about next week a little bit. You mentioned Jeff, he'll be preaching next week on working like God, which I think has great significance in connection to this sermon that you preached, Kerry, because so much of this is you have to rest from something, as you said. So you get some of that. So he's going to unpack that more next week.
I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
I think that'll be great, and yeah, there's just lots of questions in my mind swirling around that now and in our culture. What does it mean to work for people that lost their jobs and or people where work looks very different, or work has lost its purpose because it's just remote or away from people? There's just so much there. So looking forward to that, and we will have Springboard episode 22 on that sermon next week as well. So you can just be looking at the website for that to come up. But yeah, thanks everyone for listening. Thanks again, Kerry, for preaching and being here just to discuss more and give your wisdom on some of these. Yeah. Hey. So I really enjoyed it. It's a great time having this conversation, and I hope people have a good week, and we'll catch you when we see you again.
Absolutely. See you guys.